I'd like to invite all of you to participate fully with us in this Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle. So all of us are in the circle. And this is a topic that we're taking up today, entering sacred space, that follows on several other topics with which we started this year of 2021. The first was self-crafting, and hence our reading of carving your statue. And then we went from that to consecrating our work. Once we've consecrated it, we're faced with something like an empty page, which was the next of our themes. And we had to face our fear last week. And so this week, here we are, we faced our fear and we're about to enter sacred space. And so we have the good fortune of having Miku Lenentine lead us into sacred space. She's someone who has many, many meditation sessions for Still and Moving Center. She has been very, very broadly self-educated in a number of different spiritual traditions. And for today, she's going to speak from one of the Native American tribal traditions to begin with. And I have a feeling she might spread out a bit from there. So I'll let you take it away, Miku.
Well, thank you, Renee. That's actually the perfect introduction. She was asking what wisdom tradition am I drawing from? I was like, so many actually. But today I will be speaking mostly from my experience with the first people along Turtle Island, is what some people call it. And that is the first people of North Central South America, which is where I've spent most of my time sitting in sacred space, or much of it. And I wanted to give a little bit of an overview over what I would share today, and then we'll actually take some time to create a little bit of sacred space and enter into it together as an experiential part of our wisdom talk today. And also I wanted to make it a little interactive, because there's always, we're all going to talk afterward anyway, but always things come up as people are speaking. So I have a few prompts so that you can type in the chat box if you want to. So I was trying to think about all of the different people that I have sat in circle with, and wanted to give you a little bit of an overview before I dive into it. So some of the traditions that I'll be drawing from are the Shoshone Métis tradition, Haudenosaunee, Sami lineage, the Oaxaca maestros in Mexico, Costa Rican and Peruvian traditions, including the Ashaninko and Quechua. And then, of course, very specifically, we'll be sharing something from the Anishinaabe people, teaching that's very relevant to this talk. So that's some of what I'll be drawing from for you all today. And when I was trying to think about entering sacred space, I'm kind of like, I like to have structure when I think about approaching these vast topics, and always excited to hear your thoughts on it. I was thinking that when we enter sacred space, there's kind of three ways that I came up with that we might do that. One is when we enter sacred space in a group context, so that it's a group ceremony or a group gathering. There's, at least one other person there. So you're entering sacred space with others. And the other thing I came up with is when you are having a personal experience of the sacred, and you have an intentional sacred space that you're going to step into with yourself, with your own practice. And then the last one I came up with was a little bit more about sacred space in the everyday context. So the first two are really intentional. There's going to be something happening. But then for especially the first people that I've worked with in Turtle Island, that's North Central and South America, there is no space that is not the sacred space. So then that asks us what is, how do we bring that into the everyday? And so those are kind of the three things I sort of came up with to share or to speak to. And so I wanted to begin by kind of walking us through what it would be like for the first one, sitting in sacred space, entering sacred space in a group setting for some of the traditions that I've been part of. So I'm going to actually just kind of walk you through it and describe what we might experience if we were all doing it together right now. So the first thing for entering sacred space is it's usually about intention, right? So getting yourself grounded, beginning to arrive. So kind of take the invitation to kind of come into some breaths. Kind of find yourself here maybe more fully than you were just a minute ago. And we'll prepare to enter into sacred space together. And I'm going to do what I have done many times with us before and bring us in with the flute, which is a practice that I have done often for people sitting in sacred circle. So you can just kind of find that groundedness wherever you are, in your own way, whatever practice you follow, and I'll sing us in with the flute as we prepare to enter sacred circle. Okay, so at this point, I would be greeting you to enter into a sacred circle. And for many of the traditions I've sat with, it's literally a circle. And there's usually a direction that we would enter in from. And in some of them, it's the east gate. So you can kind of imagine yourself, all of us here, beginning to line up outside of the circle and facing into the east. One by one, we would make our way across the threshold. And before we would do this, we would be greeted usually by two people, sometimes one. And then there's oftentimes fire lit and tobacco. And I don't have my sage with me, but I have some Palo Santo. They would actually take some time to smudge and sage every single person before entering. So we would smudge across one side of you, smudge on the other side, maybe smudge the crown of your head. Sometimes they'll use a feather. Sometimes they'll smudge along the chakras, depends on their tradition. They would have you spin around, you'd smudge your backside. They'll tap one foot and smudge underneath, tap the other foot, smudge underneath. And then you would be invited to come into the circle. So one by one, you would be greeted and invited in. And then slowly we begin to take your seat around the space. There would probably be maybe a buffalo skull or a salmon offering at the foot of the altar for whatever it is that we're gathered for. We might be gathered to dance in a tree of life circle dance. We might be gathered to just share words. We might be gathered to celebrate a season or to celebrate a particular person. All of these are reasons that we would gather. And elders would normally sit with each other, and the young ones would normally sit with each other, and then everyone else would circle around. Depending on if it was formal or not, you might have your handcrafts with you. So we might be weaving something, or actually had a friend sitting right next to me working on moccasins. And so you'd be working on your crafts as things are settling, just depending on the nature of the particular gathering. And then before things would get started, there's usually some sort of words that are spoken. And one of my most favorite description of that is from the Haudenosaunee teaching, which is called the Thanksgiving Address. And these are known as the words that are spoken before all others. And then some person would be nominated to share just a tuning in to each of the elements of nature. And the Thanksgiving Address, the original invitation to come and gather in sacred space in this way, sometimes can take a half hour or 45 minutes just to get everybody attuned. And what they're speaking to is, for example, connect to the mother, connect to Mother Earth. And then there'd be some words to help you connect to the mother. And then the phrase is, and all our minds are one. And connect to the rivers. We would all connect to the rivers, and then let all our minds be one. And when we do this over and over and over again, and all our minds become one, then the words that are spoken before all others would be complete. And we would move into then introductions. So this is a very elaborate process, to even begin starting. Then the next thing that would be done is the first person to speak. And usually anytime someone would speak is they would have a traditional self-introduction. And I've done it for us once, might have done it at the last talk that I gave, but I think that part was missed. So I'm just going to do it again for you by example here. And it's different depending on which tradition you're from, and mine is modified. But the most important thing is really explaining your family, explaining where you're from, so that everybody who comes understands where everyone's from and their connection to the land, especially. So I would say, hello, my name is Miku Lenentine, and the bones of my ancestors are buried with the first people of Sinaloa, Mexico, in a tribe that we no longer know the name of, along my mother's side. And also the ancestors on my mother's line are buried in northern and southern Italy. I also have ancestors on my father's side that are buried in Ireland by Devil's Bit Canyon in Tipperary County, Dublin, Ireland, from the Gaelic peoples. So I want to give gratitude and thanks to my ancestors and those who came before me, for those along my mother line, those along my father line. And I also want to give gratitude to the beings from above, the star beings, and the first peoples, the first medicine peoples, and to the first fire, Tatwari. Gratitude, may we receive your wisdom now. Then we would bring this into the calling of directions, calling forth for gratitude for the beings of the north. Welcome, north. And calling forth gratitude and blessings for the beings of the east, the rising sun, which rises over and over again. Welcome, east. We take a moment of gratitude and honoring for the beings of the south, Apus, the mountain gods, the jaguar and python. Gratitude to the beings of the south. Welcome, south. Connecting to the beings of the west, the land of the water and the mystery. Gratitude to the beings of the west. Welcome, west. Gratitude to the earth, Pachamama, Aina, to the land below and the beings of below, the land where the bones of our ancestors are buried. And then lastly, into the center, deep centeredness, gratitude for the within, for the source, into Om Teot. Also, we would offer gratitude for the teachers, for all of our teachers, and for those who came before us, for them, and for those who came before us. And gratitude to each one of you that we could meet here in sacred circle in this way. So that is, and now we are ready. So now we can begin. So that is a version of something I've done many times. and then I've learned from others for sitting in sacred circle and how do we enter into sacred space. So there's a lot that goes into it and that can go on for a long time. A lot of times it's somatic. There's where we actually turn our bodies to the different directions, not necessarily just seated. But I wanted to offer that as an experiential example of what it means to enter in sacred circle together. And then take a moment to shift and speak a little bit to the personal. So, what does it mean to be in entering sacred space from a personal level? When that might mean, what do I do for myself to prepare for entering into a big group ceremony, like kind of what we just did? Like, what would you do? You know, if you're like, hey, I'm heading off to Tree of Life dance. What do I need to do to get ready? You know, so there could be that. But it could also be, oh, I have a sacred practice every morning of getting up and doing the Gayatri mantra. What do I do to prepare to sit for that personal practice? So a lot of the things are the same, whether we're preparing to sit in group practice or sit in personal practice. And this is where I wanted to invite anyone who's feeling inspired as I'm sharing ideas to chirp into the little chat box. What are personal practices that you have already that you consider sacred space? So that's kind of the first thing. So for some people, that would be maybe greeting the morning and waking up and doing sun salutation or mantra. There's a Haudenosaunee tradition for waking up and visibly greeting the sun. And also, you know, your sacred practice might be your craft. Maybe it's preparing to DJ a dance. Maybe you need to do something to get yourself into the right headspace to enter into this practice, or to design a class, or to work on a potter's wheel. These are all examples of personal practices that can be tremendously powerful sacred practices. Some simple things that people do: light a candle. So actually do that for this practice. I wanted to bring in the idea of Zoom calling. I have an article I wrote on sacred Zooming, right? So many of us are doing online teachings and meditations and things. How do we cultivate a space and enter into this space in a good way, even with our technology and computer? One trick I do is I hide all the cords with tapestries. That helps. And yeah, I'd love to hear other things that people do, and we can also talk about that after during the chat. Let's see. There are a few other things I wanted to share about kind of the personal aspect of sacred place. I think I've shared most of them: ringing bells, clapping of hands, bowing before you enter. There's also a tradition where we walk around in a big circle, gazing at the beloved, gazing at the thing that we're going to come sit with. So that's another practice that people do. Wearing ceremonial clothing to help us get into the correct space so that we can enter in a certain way. Calling forth protections and setting the intention. Sometimes that's all it takes, is to set the intention that I will show up in this way. And then the last little piece for the personal part I wanted to share about is this concept of a mesa, or a medicine bundle. I'm sure there's terms, similar things from other parts of the world, but especially the Southern Turtle Island traditions, often we have a small satchel with crystal or stones or pieces of paper or feathers, something that is holding the teaching or the wisdom that we're striving to step into. And we keep that little bundle with us. And then when it's time to enter into sacred space, we pull that bundle out. And maybe, if it's very special, we create a mesa where you put fabric down and you lay out all of these very special items out in front of you. And it's just to reflect back to you this space that you would like to be in and be present to. So that's called creating a personal mesa. Let's see, we have planting your feet on the floor, a soul room, beautiful. Yeah, there's so many things that we can do. And I think I'll keep moving us along so I leave space just to move in open dialogue. The last piece I wanted to share with you is this specific teaching, the Anishinaabe teaching. And that kind of moves us into this notion of how do we enter sacred space in our everyday life. And this teaching comes from, his name is Michael Stern, grandfather white buffalo from the Red River Anishinaabe people in Manitoba, Canada. And this teaching came to him from a spirit elder that was then taught to grandmother Karina, that was then taught to me in the form of a story. And so I'll tell it to you the way I was taught, which is called the Law of the Crow. So the Law of the Crow, it's the first law, the first teaching is that all life is sacred. And what this law is about is it's to help you remember that it's sacred in every moment, and that every moment is a miracle. And that when we're moving in space in the world, we're moving and interacting with this miracle. And in North America, especially, there's crows everywhere, and they caw in certain frequencies, but not always the same number. So it's like caw, and then caw, caw, sometimes 6 times, sometimes 2 times. So when you hear the crow call, the first call is caw, all life is sacred. The second call, caw, caw, is all life is sacred, and all life is born of woman, and women are sacred. The 3 calls, caw, 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 is that all life is sacred, all life is born of woman, and women are sacred, and then children are born of woman. So all children are sacred. If you should hear 4 calls, and they're interacting with you, the moment that you hear 3 or 2 or 1, it's a special message. That's the teaching. When you hear 4 calls, it's to remind you that all men are born of woman, and all men are sacred too. All life is sacred. So the 1 call, all life, 2 calls, woman, 3 calls, children, 4 calls, men. And if you ever hear 5 calls, this is to remind you that as you're moving in the world to do, it's called maximum efficiency, with minimal effort for optimal output for all earth, all beings, for the good of the all. That's kind of a mouthful, but basically it's kind of like move in effortless flow to maximize your good that you're doing in the world when you hear 5 calls. And the last, if you ever hear 6 calls, that's kind of rare. It's the call to oneness and to the return of the one world tree, and the reminder that we are all one. Here, there's these little zebra pigeons, and they go, "Kuprr, kuprr." Okay, someone could probably do a better impression than me. So I've been playing around with, can I do the same thing? They're a little fast, so you kind of have to be fast on it. But so far I'm hearing 3 and 4 and sometimes 1. So this teaching is an invitation to begin walking with sacred in your life, and just listening and noticing about life around you and how it's speaking to you. And how do you show up for that? So that's this offering. And so we talked about, how do we enter sacred space in a group context? How do we enter it in a personal context? And how do we do it in our everyday life? And especially this last one is this invitation to realize that you are sacred space. And how do you move in the world carrying that? And so for closing, I wanted to invite you to take a moment to make a commitment, if you like, if you feel called to it. If not, just have some moments to have a break. But if you feel called to it, this is an invitation, we'll just have a minute, to make a commitment to yourself to move in the world with being with the sacred. Move in a way that's in your integrity. A commitment to walking with the sacred in your everyday life. So if you feel called to that, take a moment for you to just think about what that looks like to walk with the sacred with just a little bit more than how you have been. And I'll ring the chime 3 times to close. So just a moment more. to make that commitment for yourself.
Hello, Nui. Miku, does the heart so much good to really just imagine the millions and probably billions of people in the world today who deliberately enter sacred space in some of the ways that you outlined for us. And it seems to awaken in me some deep memory that this is the way life is supposed to be lived. And this is the way that our ancestors for so many millennia before now have lived. It's very, very heartwarming. I really thank you so much. I want to open the floor for people who would like to make their comments and perhaps their questions for Miku.
Mahalo, Miku. Thank you so much. It was a beautiful presentation. I was very touched. And it reminded me, the first thing it reminded me of was our hula practice of the sunrise hiuvai that we participate in. And the fact that the older I am, the more I certainly appreciate just our world, because the whole world is sacred. And I think about what you said about gatherings. I mean, we had, before COVID, we had our wonderful family gatherings under my mom's mango trees. And she planted those trees with love, and that makes our homeland, our just our little house lot sacred. And it just was very touching. Thank you so much.
Miku, I really loved your presentation. I'd actually really love to hear a little bit more about creating sacred space in Zoom, just because that, is something that we do. And you did it for us so beautifully, but I'm sort of thinking about, there are people here who are teachers, who are leading groups on Zoom all the time. If you had anything more to add beyond your example. And then I also wanted to share in terms of like the sacred in the everyday. Something that I started doing recently that I've really loved is cleaning the floor for the full moon. And it just makes cleaning like more fun. I look forward to it more than just like it's a chore, but more like I'm doing something more in relation to a natural rhythm, and I'm preparing my space for the full moon. And it helps me to make this more enjoyable and to see the sacred in the everyday.
Amazing. Thank you, Janine. That's a perfect example. I was sharing that preparing for this talk was actually preparing for the talk. I had to think like, okay, I'm going to sit down and think about what I'm going to say. And then I said, no, I'm not. I'm going to clean my space. So that's the first thing I needed to do if I'm going to write about sacred space or just even connect to it. I felt like, okay, yep. And I tidied up my desk and I tidied up the space. And I was like, yep, I'm going to smudge the space. Okay, I'm going to light a candle. Cleaning is so important. And I think that that's one of the kind of personal practices that we can do to prepare ourselves either for group spaces or individual spaces is cleansing of some form, whether it's our space or ourselves, take a shower, do a salt scrub or something like that. Those are all things that we can do. But for the Zoom, that's been a real thing for me. So I usually smudge the space. I hide all the cords with the cloth. That's actually somehow really important to me. I don't know why. I just only want to see the screen. I'll send a picture, and this is a kind of a primitive setup because I just moved here, but I have had an amazing setup back home. But usually I put tapestries down. I make like a little perch for the computer screen. And so tapestries everywhere, candles, smudge, lavender spray, little misting sprays is really nice. And it probably sounds very simple, but those things go a really long way to making the electronic interactions much more nourishing. I think the fabric is nice because it brings a softness, whereas computers and technology are very hard. So something that can help balance that I find really important. Yeah. I also love to hear anyone else's practices that you do in your life just to be walking in this way.
I want to thank you so much. I don't know where to start, but I think everything that I do, and when you said it, is sacred. You walk into everything that's sacred. I went back to work with kids, and I had to walk in with emptiness and grounding myself before I walked in. I usually have tools, I have clay, I have things for the kids. And it was just so amazing because this connection I had with these teachers, and the things that came up, I just looked at the room, the closet, and all of a sudden I picked up like two things, and I had this activity that just came from nowhere. And to me, that's sacred. Now I'm going to a job on Monday and Wednesday that I heard that many of the teachers are not in that place. And it's bringing me out of my sacredness. You see what I mean? It's like I'm feeling, and so I really have to ground. So thank you so much, because I just have to walk in. That's all. And it will be there no matter what. And I think it's my connection with spirit and being Native American, or, I'm here in the mainland. I was supposed to be back in Hawaii. And it just, when you played that flute, I just felt such a connection. And I'm supposed to be connecting with my grandmother, who was supposed to take in my dog that just died and take care of him. So thank you so much for your share.
Thank you, Jessica. Robert, I saw your hand up.
Yes, in terms of the Zoom, you were talking about making Zoom a sacred space. And I agree that you had me with the flute right on. That was it. I'm still there. So that was a very, very effective way of putting one's consciousness and purifying it, and making it ready and receptive for the suggestions that you gave. So I just wanted to mention that, that I don't know how I would do that myself in a Zoom. And then the other thing is the classic Native peoples, they always salute and honor and ask the blessings of the four directions, the powers and deities associated with those directions. And likewise, I know it seems like that could be a way to create a sacred space in Zoom, but I'm not sure how you would do that in general. Anyhow, if you had any comments or suggestions, I appreciate it.
Thank you for your questions and comments. I have also found the flute is the fastest way, but not everyone can play flute. I find, and there's a learning curve because of Zoom, that I have to click a button before I play and unclick the button. So there's some little technological things to learn, but eventually it becomes easeful. And then when it's not, it's great practice anyway, right? For me. I'm not sure how the chimes went through, but I know I don't have my singing bowl with me. But the chimes and the singing bowl actually do a pretty good job also, especially the singing bowl, to just create that stillness. I think it's the vibration. There's not much that has to be done. And so I find that in person as well, though. I have a practice with a group of people where we pause before our meals. And this is a large group of people. So everyone's really hungry. I find that when I ring the chime, and it's a singing bowl chime 3 times in person, it just drops people in. So that's one that's more accessible, I think, chime and singing bowl. And the calling of directions, I did a very abbreviated version. The calling of directions is a little bit more sensitive because of the different traditions that hold that teaching. So there are calling of directions that are done and practiced from European ancestry. Starhawk is someone who's written on this and has a calling of directions that's readily available, if anyone is familiar with her. But otherwise, I think that I would stay away from more traditional calling of directions from Turtle Island, unless you have a practice already with somebody or have sat with somebody. So I think that would be just to make sure that we're doing it in an honoring way. So if you're interested in doing calling of directions, Starhawk has written up something from the Gaelic tradition, and because the circle is there too, right? So that might be something that you could look up. And I think she's written it up for the purpose of using it in meetings to help people come into a sacred space. And I believe it's in a book called The Empowerment Manual, which I wonder if Lonnie has heard about. The Empowerment Manual. So that might be a resource that you could look to.
I have not heard about that particular book, Miku. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining all of us here, like all being together. I know of Starhawk and I like her messages that I have read. I use crystals and sacred geometry in my sacred practice daily. At the moment, I'm holding a Lemurian quartz and a black tourmaline. I don't know why. It just felt like I needed to hold those. And then I also make malas. This one's rose quartz and clear quartz with some found objects. So things that they resonate on a energetic level. They're also beautiful to behold. And then sacred geometry, one of the things that has been really coming through strongly is the flower of life symbol, which is a circle with interconnected petals in a arrangement. I have one that I can bring to show you, but things like that really ground me quickly, and sound also, chimes or a bowl, or even just voicing Om will ground me really fast and help me transition from the more mundane. I kind of view the mundane things though as sacred too. Just like Janine was saying, the cleaning, you could view that as a mundane everyday type of thing, or you could elevate it to a clearing and cleansing and preparing. I really love that idea very much. So anyway, that's where I'm at with this. I'm so happy to be here.
Miku, I'm sorry that Malia had to leave, but one of her, I think it was one of her massage sessions that she did online recently. She actually had, I think like for the first 4 minutes or 3 minutes, 2 minutes before the session started, is she just had some instrumental music playing just quietly. And so when you log on, into it, you just kind of get a nice sense of calm. So that came to mind when you mentioned, or when Robert was talking about how do you approach a Zoom class, or how do you get everybody into a similar calm mindset? Thank you.
I think I'll have to make a note to share this with you, but the person, and I did my intro is normally longer than that. That was actually a very, very short version. The person that taught me this flute, his name is Osiam Chiogutin, and he is from Southern Vancouver Island, part of the Saanich Nation. He's given me permission to share his music and his classes and people's classes. And so his style, he's so much better than me. He's amazing. And so I can share, he has an album on Spotify, and I've played his music a couple times, and it's just amazing. It just sets the scene right away. So I can try to send you the link, I guess, to that. Maybe we can do a follow-up email for people.
Miku?
Can I call on you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Miku. That was stunning, really. And I think one of the things you've reminded us of is that we are in this kind of a new era with Zoom meetings, right? And we're learning how to transfer from what was normally interpersonal group meeting in a space which we already we had to prepare to come to, and we were already thinking of it as being a sacred space, that we're going to engage in deep thought and communion. I love the way you started out, that we would we are here to all become of one mind. That was, I think, one of the first things you mentioned, right? And that seems like that's such a critical component. But there were so many things that you mentioned that seem to me to be vital. So the practice that Gems has, beginning with the reading. I don't know how many times I've heard the reading that Renee used to use, learn from these facets of nature. Probably, in my last 40 years, I probably heard that reading thousands of times. Each time there would be like something would unfold, and it would like create this space that people who were tuning into the same thing. And so this is kind of the one thing that I wanted to focus on. There were so many elements that I really thought were wonderful that you mentioned, but this whole idea that nature has this inherent wisdom in it, communicating to us if we have the ears to hear it. And so that one example you gave of having natural objects that have that wisdom inherent in them. And that's what we're trying to learn. We're trying to learn from nature, from the facets of nature that are in natural things, right? Because we want to work with nature. We want to be in harmony with nature, right? But the other thing that you mentioned about was about birds and the calls of the crow. I just love that, because over the last few years, I've had probably 2 or 3 dozen kind of interactions with birds that gave me the conviction that I was actually being communicated with by higher beings. And I'm curious about that, how obviously the Native Americans, first American peoples had cultivated that sensitivity to a high degree, one would assume, of this being able to read and to learn from nature. But this idea that each call of the bird has a specific meaning associated with it, and depending on the number, there's a specific thing that's being communicated. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, yes, I'd be happy to. Okay, and I will double check with Grandmother Kanita after this talk and make sure I have all this right. But the law of the crow, especially that one, was gifted to Grandmother Karina when she was younger, And she was asking for advice, I think, on, yes, how to walk in a sacred way. And she told me that, I mean, and this is the way that she spoke of it. He said like, oh, basically, white people, you need specific instructions. And he like wrote it down on little tiny pieces of paper. And so she had this like initiation on these little crumpled pieces of paper. And this is a real teaching. But I think that even the way that kind of transmission happened sort of speaks to that this is training wheels in a way. The law of the crow, every time I hear it, every time I share it, I get shivers. It's very powerful. And yet even then, it's sort of still training wheels for not needing those pieces of paper, for really being able to listen and hear the voice speaking through all of life. And so I'm glad you asked that question, because I wasn't necessarily going to share this part. So I think it's the beginning to tune, to sensitize ourselves to these messages, to the voices of all beings. And then you'll be able to hear them without the pieces of paper. And so that's true for, all different kinds, especially trees and plant beings have a very different way of speaking to us. So I don't know, hopefully that's helpful, but it's sitting with that practice will then open the gates for the deepening to happen on its own.
So the pieces of paper that you mentioned, that was like her writing down what she thought what the message was? Is that what you're saying?
No, he wrote it down. He wrote it down for her on pieces of paper, but it was a teaching that was given to him by a spirit uncle. And even as the story goes, I'm unclear if that's a physical being or not. So it went through multiple levels of translation to then get translated into English, to then be into the written word, to then be gifted to her. But it is still holding, the original transmission. Yes. Yeah.
Can I ask you one more other question?
Mm-hmm.
So in the traditions that you were referring to, was there also this concept that the circle that folks are creating is also a kind of like a reflection of a larger circle, or a cosmic circle? So that relationship between the microcosm and macrocosm, is that also part of the teaching?
Yes, definitely. Yes, the hoop the circle is symbolic of the circle of life. And that also I learned this concept of something called hoop time. I think I shared it in satsang before. This is a Shoshone Métis teaching I learned. So the hoop, the circle, is an understanding that wherever you are on this circle, as you leave one point, you're returning back. So it's the understanding that time is continuous. And there's even a song that goes with it. Each step that you take out your door is a step coming back. And so there is absolutely symbolism in the sacred circle that we sit in.
Ben?
I wanted to say that here in Kaava, we have a lot of roosters, and you might hear them in the background as I talk. There you go. And I feel like nowadays they're always saying the same thing, which is Happy Earth Day. Happy Earth Day. Happy Earth Day. But I also liked your comment that it's training wheels, right? And so maybe the wheels will change. Thank you very much. A lovely presentation.
Thank you, Ben. That reminds me of one more thing I remembered, that part of listening, just not just listening to the sounds of the birds, but listening to the sound of the wind is another great practice. Just that when you're having a conversation with someone, this is something my teacher would do. You're having a conversation and suddenly the wind rustles up really loud, right? Or a tree limb cracks or something, right? So that's them participating in the conversation. And it's the way I was taught is that is then the moment to pause and think like, okay, what just happened in that conversation? Is there something else to be paying attention to here? So there's a mindfulness aspect to it where we're learning to listen to, or like a squabble of birds get really loud and you're like mid-conversation with someone else, or you're noticing something on the ground, that it's all connected and it's all part of a conversation.
Miku, just thank you for that same ceremony 2 weeks ago at the dance. You did a variation of that, which got the dances on the third floor, open lanai, right, looking over the, is it the swamp or the marsh that backs right up to the Ko'olau Mountains in Kailua. And as you did the ceremony, the birds, or whatever those are that are out there, woke up. And then while we were dancing, also when the crowd would get really up, you'd hear them, the birds all going off out there, just enjoying the conversation. It was beautiful. Thank you.
You're so welcome, David. That was uncanny, actually. It's really fun when it becomes very obvious. Most of the time this is subtle, but sometimes it's really obvious and you're just kind of blown away like, wow, yep, this is happening right now.
Kathy, do you have something you would like to share with us?
I'm just thinking how much I'm enjoying the conversation. And I was thinking about birds and wind because I wake up with the birds every morning and I always feel they're talking to me. I don't always have any idea what they're saying. But I'm watching the wind today carrying the trees outside back and forth. And I know that I often think about how much it looks like when you're underwater as well, and the currents in the ocean are moving the plants there back and forth. And the difference is that this wind is not moving me, but in the water, it takes me with it. So I just sort of rambling thoughts that keep moving through everyone else's. Yeah. You must have seen me having those feelings more than anything. Yeah.
I wonder if Jenny would be willing to share a few thoughts with me. I think she's had some sacred experiences with nature.
When I was listening to Miku, she talked about at the time of living gratitude, and then a few other things that she mentioned. One of them was to think about the beings that I believe she said came in with her, and they may go out with her or with one, or they may need to leave, in which case you mentioned they could go in humor and humility. But this idea of the beings that accompanied, I wondered if you could say more about how those beings are envisioned, and are they there to, like, for instance, to help wake up the mind and the heart when one is in a group experience?
That's a really fun question. I've never thought about it before. Some of these things are very experiential for me, so to speak about them is my first time, and that is a great question. What I have been taught and almost scolded for multiple times is that when we call directions, especially directions, we are casting a sacred circle. We're inviting in the being of the East, the being of the North, to be with us. We're actually inviting them into the space. And it was told, at least in a kind way, that it's good manners to then let them leave. That's how it was explained to me. And so whenever we, especially the calling of directions, turn and face each direction and welcome any being into the space that we're in, it's important that when we leave that sacred space, we invite them to go if they like. I add the little thing in the end of stay if they, if they want to, you can stay, but go if you must. With humor and humility, we let you go, send you back to source. Their function in circle is an interesting question. My experience with them, and I'd love to hear anyone else's here, is that they are like, how do I say it? Like brother and sister. They're like, they're family. These beings are family. They're kin. So, and yet they're also, deeply powerful. But I don't, especially the beings that we called in, I don't think of them as a deity, but it's a complicated question. Yeah, I think of them as kin, as family, as vast, right? But not quite the same as like when I work with Kuan Yin, for example. Very different, actually. So I don't think I have a very good answer for what their role is, but I do know that's my relationship to them, is like family and kin. So what do you do when you call your favorite, most amazing family member to come sit with you in the space? That's the best answer I think I can give.
That sounds like a perfectly wonderful and great answer to a deep and, as you say, complex question, as it probably it depends on who we are calling in or what it is that we are calling in. And yet the suggestion that we should always then give them invitation, permission to leave seems like proper etiquette that we want to have with all beings. Wonderful. Is there anyone who is called to give Miku a vote of thanks before we leave this meeting today? Next week's meeting is going to be on the topic of thought before form. So once we have entered sacred space with this idea of creativity, we want to make sure that we are moving from within without, shall we say, thought before form. So that will be next week. And to close, though, this week, to close our sacred space, can I invite one of you to give a vote of thanks to Miku? Sorry, Beth, would you like to do that maybe? Would you like to thank Miku for what she's presented today?
Oh, I would love to. Thank you for everything you've offered us and coming into this space for me. And that I came into this and went, wow, thank you. And all the people. So thank you very much for giving us so much enlightenment and making my week feel so much more lighter and going into the rest of the week. And I hope everybody else feels the same way. So thank you.
Absolutely.
And you're so wonderful and beautiful. And I just love how you just came with, just like you were saying, you covered the chords, you did this, and it's a sacred space. And thank you. So I got to go create my own sacred space. So thanks. Thank you.
Okay, and the one important thing about entering sacred space that has been taught to me over and over is how do we leave it? How do we leave it, especially those ones that we're really consciously stepping into? And so I'll do a very abbreviated close, which is gratitude, and raise my hands up. Gratitude to all of the beings who have come in with us into the sacred space today. Stay in our hearts, if you will. Go if you must. With humor and humility, I give thanks to you. Thank you, Creator Tamkashla. Thank you for one more sacred day. Ahe, for all of our relations, Omateo. And that's it.
I think we've all been so blessed and are very appreciative, Miku. Thank you so much. And aloha to all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Miku.
It's
Thank
wonderful.
you, Miku.
Beautiful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you and the crows.
Yes. Ah, caw. All life is sacred.